Hello, everyone. Jeff Jerome again. I hope you have been enjoying the Edgar Allan Poe birthday celebration. I know I have, but you're in for a special treat right now. We have, well, actually, Debbie, introduce yourself to our audience.
Happily. Hi, my name is Debbie Phillips. I am from Richmond, Virginia, where, of course, Mr. Poe spent most of his years, more years than anywhere else, rather. And it's a pleasure to be here.
She will be portraying Virginia Poe. Now, what I find really exciting about this is you read about these people, but to the best of my knowledge, there's no one out there portraying the women in Poe's life, and you do.
I do.
Yes. So tell the audience a basic question. Why Virginia?
Why Virginia? Because I didn't start with her. I started with his mother. I have portrayed his fiance as well many times, Elmira Shelton, Fanny Osgood. Virginia came to me because this is the year of her bicentennial, and I was approached and asked to create a program for Virginia Poe, and she was always a character I found intriguing. I think most people who study Poe find his wife an intriguing figure because of the circumstances of their marriage, because she was 13 and his cousin when they were married. And then, of course, she died that horribly tragic death. And I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to shine a new perspective on the man that is Poe by speaking as his wife, talking about their home life, for instance, which most, you don't hear about that from a lot of scholars. What was the home life like?
Right, correct. Well, we don't know a lot about her in the sense that we have very few letters.
Yes.
How many letters do you know that? One or two?
One
maybe?
or two. And that's a challenge I have come across with some of my other characters. I mean, I portray other characters other than Poe-related women, Martha Washington, for instance, who left us an abundance of letters. And so it's either feast or famine when you're coming up with your living history scripts. I am a historian, I'm a researcher, I do all my own research, I write my own scripts, I perform, and they are, when I have characters like his mother Eliza and like Virginia, where we have so little of their own words and their own opinions, I have to take my sources from their peers and those that were around them, because people wrote about these women. People were very, very fascinated. People wrote about these women. Their peers were very interested in the couple of the Poes. I'm so sorry. See, people wrote about these women, and so I have to take the words of their contemporaries, the words of their peers, and sometimes very different perspectives, which I find as a researcher is very helpful to create a more well-rounded character, and glean from what other people have said about them so that I can try to give them a voice. And that's a challenge. And
Well, I've seen you perform as Virginia. And whenever I see something new, I always have my doubts. And that's not fair to the actor or actress, but I've seen so many interpretations where you just go, oh, it's all wrong, it's awful. No, don't do that. Be quiet. But when I saw you, we've been friends for many years, so I knew that you were a good actress to begin with. So it wasn't like, who is this person doing Virginia? And I was just really thrilled. And at one point, actually there were two times during your performance where I got a little teary-eyed. And I think what a compliment to the actress or actor that you can get that kind of response.
thank you.
Of course, I'm, as you all know, totally dedicated to talking about Poe and dispelling many of the myths and legends and lies about Poe. And here you come along doing Virginia, and I was just sitting there and going, this is great. This is really good. Getting a little teary-eyed, watching you. So, I mean, what a compliment for you. Now, most people like to know, when did you first discover Poe? Poe? And most people say, oh, I was in the 4th grade, middle school. That's when I discovered Poe. When did you discover Poe?
I remember reading a good number of his works in 7th grade. I think my teacher did like Poe quite a lot. She did not communicate that terribly well to me as a student. I did not like Poe. I did not connect with him. The story of the black cat, as an animal lover and as a cat owner, was very hard for me to swallow when I
can understand.
When I was 12. I mean, I had no real perspective for that, and I don't know that she was setting the stage and explaining what he was trying to achieve with his horror. And so I had in my mind for years and years, I can't stand that guy. And I was working at St. John's Church in Richmond, and that is the final resting place of his mother, Eliza Poe, who was, of course, a great actress and performer. And they asked me to do a little, 5-minute thing as her for their graveyard tour. This was 2008. And I became interested in her, not as Poe's mother necessarily, but as this woman who was an actress in that time period. And I began studying her. And in studying her and in finding, of course, Gedeth Smith's wonderful book, The Brief Career of Eliza Poe, I realized that her very brief life and her very brief time with Edgar, and more importantly, her very traumatic death possibly occurring in front of Edgar, as some scholars have argued based on the resources, would have had a significant impact on him as a toddler. He was almost 3 when his mother passed away of tuberculosis, coughing up blood, and we know that the children, or at least Rosalie and Edgar, were with her in Richmond towards the end of her life, and I think that helped me to appreciate some of his darker works. Well, I have a toddler now. They notice everything. They absorb and repeat back to you more than you would like sometimes. And realizing that this little baby, watched his mom, God, what that would have done to him. And that helped me to begin to appreciate him. And so now I love Edgar. I love reading him. Black Cat is still hard for me, but I do love Edgar.
Well, it's obvious from the way you perform that you do have that love. You finally came around.
It took a while.
It took a while. So, what's on the horizon for you?
Oh, well, heretofore I have, most of my characters have been Virginia-based women, because I'm in Richmond and I perform for local audiences there. Virginia Poe is one of the first characters that, she has ties to Richmond, Virginia, of course, but that's not where the bulk of her experience in life was. And so that's got me thinking about some other characters I might do down the road. Later on, Eleanor Roosevelt would be fun, I think. And regarding Poe women, I think it would be fun to do Muddy one day, or even Sarah Helen Whitman. She would be brilliant.
Sarah Helen Whitman.
Yes.
Did you know that in Providence, Rhode Island, there's a young independent Poe scholar, Levi,
I've heard of
and he has resurrected her spirit. It seems like the people in Providence have forgotten about her.
Yeah.
And she was such a dynamo when she was alive.
She really was.
And he has a celebration at her gravesite every year, and I've been fortunate enough to be invited to speak there, and I would urge all of you in that area to check it out, because you will be amazed. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
She was such a, I hate to say a character, but she was, what kind of woman was she?
From what I've read, very, like you said, very dynamic, very independent, free-thinking woman. In the program, I've given a decent amount of thought into what the program would look like, and there would be an interactive portion for the audience, which is not something I normally do.
She was also interested in the supernatural?
Yes, she was.
You're not thinking of conjuring up any ghost during your performance, are you?
If I were successful, that would be quite a boon for the audience. But I think having one of her sessions would be a lot of fun.
Well,
get the audience involved.
That sounds fantastic, and I really hope you do pursue her, because that would be just unbelievable.
I will let you know.
Oh yes,
I will keep
yes,
you informed.
I appreciate that. Well, Debbie, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and to the audience. And we've got people around the world watching you right now. So thank you. And I think we are ready for Mrs. Poe.
Ah, yes, she's here.
Sounds good.
Good day to you. I am Virginia Eliza Clemm Poe, and I'm so honored to be asked to speak to such a wonderful audience from around the world. I find when I talk to people about who I am and who my husband is that there's such a look of curiosity that enters their eyes. How autobiographical is this man's pen? This is the man who writes of horrific, nightmarish things, but also the deepest love poetry. So frequently, the women of his tales are elevated to a lofty, almost ethereal status, only to leave their narrator bereft with their inevitable demise. So I find that when I introduce myself to people, they immediately start honing in, who is this woman who has knit her soul to Edgar Allan Poe? Is he a madman? I'm here to assure you that he is most certainly not. He is brilliant. He's a genius. He is able to articulate our deepest, darkest thoughts and also our loftiest dreams. Ours has been a happy home, a wonderful marriage, and I'm hoping to shed some light on the man that is my husband, Edgar Allan Poe, that genius, for you all today. Muddy reminds me that it was a very hot day in August when I was born in 1822. I was the last of 8 children by my father and the last of 3 by my mother. My father had been married before to my mother's cousin, Harriet Poe, and as was the custom in Baltimore society, when Harriet passed away, he married my Muddy. And Mr. Clemm's family was one of trade and business, and they didn't precisely approve of the match with Muddy, but he and she had 3 beautiful children together, so she's told me. I had an older sister whose name was Virginia, and a brother named Henry. I was the last child to be born, and I was apparently just the baby for many months. My older sister was very sick when I was born, and she passed away just a few months later. And it was at the time of her funeral that I was christened Virginia, and they gave me my sister's name. Well, Papa passed away when I was 2 or 3, it's but a dim memory for me. And we lived with my grandmama after that. Grandpapa and Grandmama Poe were great heroes of the Revolution in Baltimore. Grandpapa had been one of the quartermasters for the Marquis de Lafayette's troops, helping to supply those men when they were helping to defend Baltimore from the British. And Grandmama, well, she sewed thousands of breeches, so they say, for the soldiers in the Marquis de Lafayette's army. And when Grandpapa passed, Grandmama was left in rather dire straits, which is, of course, around the time she moved in with Muddy, with my mother. I remember when the Marquis de Lafayette visited, I was so small and he was so tall. He insisted on seeing my grandmama. And apparently it was because of his concerns over the dire straits that she was living in that the city finally began to award her a pension for her and Grandpapa's service and sacrifice during the Revolution, for truly Grandpapa had spent much of the family fortune in supplying the Marquis's troops. And it was because of that Grandmama was able to help support her daughter's household with a modest pension, and Muddy brought in mending and sewing, and she kept a wax neat house. I remember our little home. My childhood, my infancy were happy enough as I can recall. We didn't have much, but I always felt like we had enough. My brother Henry was there, and my cousin Henry Poe. I remember him being very tall, very handsome, of a melancholy nature. He went off to sea, and when he returned, he was writing these very interesting stories. I was a very little girl, so I don't remember a lot of the details of the stories because some of them were kind of scary. But Henry was a very talented author. I was 8 years old when his brother, my cousin Eddie, joined our household. Eddie had just left the Military Academy of West Point. It was a very striking military bearing. He and Henry were so overjoyed at being together. I distinctly remember that. The circumstances of their youth had kept them apart for most of their lives, and so the brothers were so happy to be reunited. You see, their mother, Eliza Arnold Poe, was a very talented actress, and she had married Muddy's older brother David, who had great aspirations on the stage, but some have said that he perhaps didn't have, then perhaps he should have chosen a different path. But that being neither here nor there, I understand that he left the family under circumstances I've only heard whispers alluded to. I don't know the circumstances, but from what I understand, dear Eliza found herself with the children and, quite overwhelmed, sent the oldest boy, Henry, here to Baltimore so he could live with his grandparents. And when she passed away in Richmond, Henry's brother and sister, Eddie and Rosalie, were taken in by families there. The family that took in Eddie was the Allan family, Mr. and Mrs. Allan. And I understand now that Eddie had a very difficult relationship with Mr. Allan, his foster father, but that he and Mrs. Allan doted on each other. Mrs. Allan was of a nervous disposition. She had many health concerns, and she seemed very frightened at the idea that Eddie's Baltimore relations would come and take him away from her. And so she did not discourage much correspondence between the brothers. In fact, I would even venture to say there wasn't much of a relationship between the two until they were in their teen years. But still never seeing each other, just keeping up a correspondence. When he moved in, Henry was so overjoyed. And the brothers collaborated together. I remember them poring over their writing under the candlelight and Muddy insisting that they go to bed. They were so happy for such a short time. But then Henry had some problems with that curse that has long plagued my family of drink. And it was hard for him to turn from the bottle. And when Eddie joined our household, Henry was already very ill from the effects of drinking too much and from the consumption. I remember when he passed away, just at my 9th birthday, how heartbroken Eddie was. I believe Eddie cursed the fates that brought him and his brother together, only to rend them apart after such a short time. There were times after Henry's death I could tell Eddie felt so very alone. Eddie's poem, Alone. From childhood's hour I have not been as others were, I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. Henry's death seemed to push Eddie into a fervor, a fury of writing. He'd long been composing poems, beautiful poems, sometimes very stirring and disturbing poems, but Henry had been composing short stories, and that was a form of American literature that Eddie felt should be explored. He wanted very much to explore the different types of short stories one could create if one were not writing in the novel form. What are the sensations one could create in such a short volume? And he began writing some, wonderfully disturbing tales. Metzengerstein, his Gothic horror. Berenice, where the narrator has an unhealthy obsession with his wife's teeth. Morella, tale of rebirth, time and time again. It was his story, a manuscript found in a bottle, that really won the attention of many of the publishers around the nation. Eddie had been trying to support our family. He had been penning short works for some small dollars. He couldn't get a job as a teacher because Mr. Allan had not supported him enough at the University of Virginia for him to complete his degree. And so he was trying very hard to support our family, and an opportunity arose for him in what he considered his hometown of Richmond. A new magazine had been started, the Southern Literary Messenger, and the editor, the owner of that magazine, Mr. White, wished to elevate Southern literature, which is very much a vision that Eddie agreed with. He was offered an opportunity to return to Richmond and work for Mr. White, and he did. Grandmama had passed away just a few weeks before, and I remember him promising he was going to send us money. He always intended to support us. He's always been most solicitous in his care of Muddy and I. He promised he would send money. Grandmama's pension was gone, and it was not long before we were in very dire straits. Muddy was very concerned about how she was going to support our household, and nothing was coming from Richmond yet. I remember my cousin Nelson, who was married to my half-sister Josephine, reached out to Muddy during this time and offered to take me in and continue my education. I must continue my education and properly enter Baltimore society. Muddy wrote to Eddie, describing Nelson's offer and discussing whether or not she was interested in taking it. I remember Eddie's response. He wrote with such a fever, with such passion. I remember Muddy wept as I read his letter. He felt so deeply and utterly betrayed by the very idea that she would take Nelson up on this offer. You could tell he was terribly frightened and offended. You see, we were his family. His mother, Eliza, who had loved him, died before he was 3. His dear foster mother, who had loved him, had passed away just a few years before, and his foster father, Mr. Allan, wanted nothing to do with him. We were his family. We were his family. And he saw Nelson reaching in and trying to take us away, and I fear he truly panicked. I truly feel that he panicked. In his letter, he proclaimed his love for me. And at the end, there was a postscript addressed to me, my sissy, as he called me, my dear little wifey. I cannot tell you how I felt at this moment in reading those words. I had loved him as a brother and more for many years. Many have said that I'm his muse, but truly he is my muse. And to hear him say he loved me, to read those words, I can hardly describe how I felt. There was a giddiness almost. And Muddy spoke long with me about how if we were to go to Richmond and be with him, if he and I were to be married, how we could help him so much. She feared from the tone and tenor of his letter that he'd been drinking. And like his brother and like his father before him, when Eddie drank, Oh, terrible things sometimes could happen. And there was a weakness there that he had worked so hard to overcome while taking care of Muddy and myself. But he was alone in Richmond, and he was scared, and he was drinking. And I understood if I were to marry him and we were to go and live with him, we could better prepare him and support him to avoid that evil temptation of drink. And therefore, by being his wife, Muddy and I would enter under his protection, and he would be our guardian. And nothing in this world short of death could separate us from each other ever again. And so it did not take much persuasion for me to agree to marry Eddie. I wanted to. Even if I hadn't wanted to, I had no recourse. My mother had made a choice that she believed was truly in my best interest. And as a child of 13 years, it was not my place to countermand my mother in any circumstances. She knew it was best for me. And so Eddie came back to Baltimore to collect us. He did take out a special license for us to be married. Muddy encouraged him, let's return to Richmond and the wedding could take place there. And I remember he had written that he had a beautiful cottage with a lovely garden. We were staying in a boarding house across from the Capitol. But the Capitol had a lovely park around it and a French garden design. So it was like we had a large garden right in our front yard. I remember the wedding. The Reverend Converse looked very shocked when he saw the marriage license, which proclaimed me to be a full 21 years of age. Muddy had signed it. Muddy knew exactly what she was doing and taking care of our family. I was certainly not 21 years of age. I was 13 and Eddie was 27. I remember playing leapfrog in the Capitol Square with him. He loved showing me his hometown. He took me to all of his childhood haunts, showed me the mansion in Moldavia where the late Mr. Allan had taken him to live as a boy. And he took me to Shockoe Hill Cemetery, where we stopped for a time beside Mrs. Allan's grave. And then we stopped again by another grave of a lady, Jane Craig Stannard. And I asked him, who is this lady? She was his first muse, the mother of one of his best friends. And he had such a boyhood crush on her, but one that inspired one of the most beautiful poems I've ever read. Eddie's poem, To Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the beauty of fair Greece and the grandeur of old Rome. Lo, in that little window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the folded scroll within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. We didn't stay in Richmond long. Eddie later told me that he found it to be the hardest task in the world to coin one's brain into silver at the nod of a master. And so he left Mr. White's employment. We traveled to New York and then settled in Philadelphia, where he did find employment with other magazines. He worked for Burton's, for Graham's for a time. He had a vision, though, of having his own publication where he would be in charge. He would set the tone and the quality for the submissions. He felt these other magazines he was working for were sometimes producing work that was just bringing down American literature. And again, he wished so much to elevate it and to explore the different forms that writing could take. He mastered several different genres, even inventing one or two. His detective tales, where Monsieur Dupin uses analysis and logic to solve crimes which otherwise are baffling the police. The word detective had not existed before. That is a fascinating new genre of literature that my Eddie has created, and I truly hope that authors in the future will play with that form of the detective trying to solve the unsolvable crime. Of course, so many of his tales place you in the mind of the narrator so that you find as you are reading it that you are experiencing these same horrors. The tale Loss of Breath, where you find yourself slowly being suffocated. The premature burial, where you imagine that you are yourself within this tightly contained box. And at the end, you're laughing with relief. The Telltale Heart, where he takes you within the mind, the reasoning, if one can call it that, of the killer, the narrator. No one was writing in this way, where you place the reader within the predicament of the story in such an effective way. Oh, my Eddie had a way with words. So many people remember his tales of horror. Who can forget the Black Cat? Oh, the pit and the pendulum. Oh, the horror, the terror of that situation. But many are surprised to learn that most of his stories are stories of humor, of wit. Eddie had a wonderful sense of humor, and he loved playing with words and making jokes out of them. In his stories, Some Words with a Mummy, the mummy's name is Count Alamisteco. You must read that story if you haven't. And I love his tale, Why the Little Frenchman Wears His Arm in a Sling. And if you are wondering now why the little Frenchman wears his arm in a sling, I hope that you will read that story. But read it out loud, for Eddie wanted you to hear what his characters sounded like. And so it is written in an Irish accent, which does not make itself clear until you're reading the story out loud. See, so much of Eddie's works were meant to be read out loud. Yes, he was mastering the short story, but he always wanted to be known as a poet. His poetry was meant to be read out loud. And when read out loud, it reflects not only his mastering of the English language, but tempo and musicality. I remember his poem, The Raven, is one that swept across the nation because when read out loud, and almost a sing-song voice, it is such an impactful story. It is such an interesting tale that the narrator takes you on, and the message that this ominous bird of yore is sending to him. So Eddie loved music. Ours was always a home of music and of joy and laughter. He insisted on my continuing with my education, even when we could barely afford more than bread and molasses to eat. He insisted on me keeping a piano so I could continue to practice. He loved playing the flute with me to my accompaniment, and we sang together. Oh gosh, I remember the terrible puns that he and Muddy would share with one another. He would challenge his readership in these different magazines to submit riddles and whatnot to him so that he could solve them. And at home, he and Muddy kept that spirit alive, and I was subjected to many plays on words. I'll give you some examples of some of Muddy's finest. What was Eve's bridal dress? A bear skin. How does a stove feel when it is full of coals? Grateful. Oh, Muddy. Oh, it almost hurts. Oh, but we did laugh a lot in our home, and many are very shocked to hear that ours was a home of laughter and joy and music, so much music. Unfortunately, it was while I was singing one evening to Eddie, when I was 19 years old, that I began to show some very serious signs of illness. Poor Eddie. To this day, he insists that I had an accident while singing, that I burst a blood vessel in my throat while I was singing. For truly, copious amounts of the brightest red blood came up. It was terrifying. I remember being very ill after that, and Eddie staying by my bedside with his eyes wild with fear and feverish over me as I lay coughing and not sure if I would make it to the next morn. We knew it was consumption, the same terrible disease that took his mother and his dear foster mother and Henry, his brother. But he insisted I'd had an accident. It was only an accident, and that I would recover. And by some miracle, I did recover. And then several months later, the scene repeated. And then this pattern became almost the norm of our lives. Oh, poor Eddie. If there has been any stumbling block to my husband's success, it has been the unfortunate propensity that he has to succumb to the temptation of drink and the distraction of drink when life and the circumstances of life are just too heavy and too real. And so, during times of my most severest illness, Eddie would drink. He would sometimes disappear for days on end, and Muddy and I would be left in a fever, wondering where he is, what has become of him. Please do not judge him for the way that he coped with my illness. We have no medicine for this disease. There's nothing that can be done but to bide our time and wait for the sweet release of death and for no more of the suffering to continue. And it is because of his devastation at watching me suffer that he has been drinking. I was so pleased when The Raven was published and he was welcomed into the literary societies in New York. Miss Charlotte Lynch has very fashionable soirees, and she invited him. And during that time, when he'd be invited to go and mingle with some of the brightest, most brilliant authors of our day, I feel sometimes when he was there, he was able to briefly forget the pain that was waiting for him at home. I was so proud of him. He was becoming quite famous, and he made many, many good friends. Miss Lynch was a sweet lady. I remember attending a few of her soirees before my illness necessitated that I remain at home. And dear Fanny, Fanny, Mrs. Osgood is a dear, dear friend. I won't hear anything negative about her. So many people who love to malign my Eddie and those whom he esteems because they are so jealous. I won't hear anything ill of Fanny. She is a dear friend. And of course, I've heard whispers that he loves her, but of course he loves her. She is wit and intelligence and passion and beauty all in one charming person. I won't hear anything spoken against her. Last Valentine's Day, Eddie composed a beautiful poem for her. It's an acrostic, one of his favorite styles, but instead of the first letter of each line spelling out a secret meaning, it is the first letter of the first line, the second letter of the second line, the third of the third, the fourth, and so on. And in those lines, if one is to read in this way, you can see her name, Frances Sargent Osgood. It is a beautiful poem, and he gave it to her on Valentine's Day last. Eddie's poem to Mrs. Osgood, to her whose name is written below. For her these lines are penned, whose luminous eyes, bright and expressive as the stars of Leda, shall find her own sweet name, that, nestling, lies upon this page enwrapped from every reader. Search narrowly these words, which hold a treasure divine, a talisman, an amulet that must be worn at heart. Search well the measure, the words, the letters themselves. Do not forget the smallest point, or you may lose your labor. And yet there is in this no Gordian knot, which one might not undo without a saber. If one could merely comprehend the plot upon the open page, on which are peering such sweet eyes now, there lies, I say perdue, a musical name, oft uttered in the hearing of poets, by poets, for the name is a poet's too. In common sequence set, the letters lying compose a sound delighting all to hear. Ah, this you'd have no trouble in descrying, were you not something of a dunce, my dear. And now I leave these riddles to their seer. Recently, I have been very concerned about my Eddie and his health. Excuse me. My own health seems to be rapidly failing. He's moved us, me and Muddy. We are now in a beautiful cottage outside of the city of New York in the little village of Fordham. In our little cottage, we are trying to make such a paradise for ourselves here on this earth. But I do fear that the end might be coming sooner rather than later for me, and that truly he may not survive that loss. And so I am deeply concerned for my Eddie. Truth be told, when I found that he'd composed such a beautiful poem to Mrs. Osgood last Valentine's Day, I felt a bit of a pang. And I composed my own poem for him. I hope that you will enjoy it. This is my poem for Eddie. It's called Valentine. It's also an acrostic, but I'm not as witty as my husband, and so it is only the first letter of each line which spells out that name that is so dear to me, Edgar Allan Poe. Ever with thee I wish to roam, dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home and a rich old cypress vine. Removed from the world with its sin and care and the tattling of many tongues, love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see. Perfect ease we'll enjoy, without thinking to lend ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful we'll be. Dear Eddie, see, I fear that soon I will be his guardian angel. It reminds me of a song that he loves so much. He has often begged different women to sing this song to him. It is his favorite song. I would like to sing it to you so that maybe you can understand my Eddie a little bit more. It's composed by Thomas Moore, not Sir Thomas More, but Thomas Moore with two O's. It's a beautiful song called Come Rest in This Bosom. Come rest in this bosom, my own stricken dear. Though the herd have fled from thee, thy home is still here. Here still is the smile that no cloud can o'ercast, and the heart and the handle they own to the last. and shame. I know not, I ask not, if guilt is in the heart. I but know that I love thee, whatever thou art. Thou hast called me thy angel in moments of bliss. Still thy angel I'll be mid the horrors of this. Through the furnace unshrinking thy steps to pursue, and shield thee and save thee, or perish there too. I'm so sorry. I do apologize. As I said, my health, I feel, is rapidly deteriorating. But I do thank you for watching this today, and I hope that you've learned a little bit more about my dear Eddie, and will tell others and share with others about him. My dear Eddie. Soon, I will be his guardian angel. Thank you.